What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Joushi Rambling. Today I'm going to be talking about teams a little bit. I've had a couple people in my Discord asking me to just make a brief tutorial on how teams works and talk about some of the things that you oftentimes see. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on how the team's pairing process works and how you can think about it in some general ways. We'll have a brief discussion on guard's role in teams within that whole cycle, and um, also just kind of talk about just teams in general and why it's a lot of fun. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is why teams is super fun. And the big thing, there's a couple major reasons why. There's a lot of people, including myself, who say that teams is the best way for 40k to be played. And one of the first reasons why is we all kind of know and accept that 40k is inherently kind of an unbalanced game, right? It's not strictly rock, paper, scissors, but there are a lot of matchups that are heavily favored one way or another. Um, and then there are other matchups that really depend on the board that they're being played on, right? Tau versus World Eaters on a completely open board is very different than Tau versus World Eaters on a board where it is very closed. So, the World Eaters either just get blown off the board on the open board, or they get really close and the Tau can't shoot them before the World Eaters just blow them apart in close combat. And teams is a way that you alleviate a lot of those problems. The other big thing about teams that is really fun is in a singles environment, you'll oftentimes find, oftentimes by, the end of turn 3, sometimes as early as turn 2, and then additionally, the last couple of turns usually, or not usually, but oftentimes just don't matter in a game because you've already determined after maybe two of the three turns or two or three turns that someone has already won the game. And in a singles environment, that's all that matters. You don't care how close the score was. Typically, you don't care how many points the loser scored. Sometimes battle points as a tiebreaker, but more often than not, it only matters whether or not you won or lost the game. And that's not true in teams. In a teams environment, you care about the differential. Losing 100 to 80 is way different than losing 100 to 50. And you care about that. And because you care about the end score of both players so much, you're actually really incentivized to play all 5 turns of the game in ways that you don't really care about in singles. And so it really allows someone who is behind and losing to feel like they still have agency to play for the rest of the team. The last big reason why I think teams is super fun is because you play with the same people, right? You oftentimes have a core of other players that you play rather consistently with. If you're playing with the same people over and over again, you have an idea as hey, maybe this guy really likes playing really aggressive games, and that guy just really wants to not lose. And you can play around them in different ways. And the other big thing is sometimes you'll hear, hey, Jimmy just rolled 44 ups in a row, and every single one of his Terminators that was supposed to be dead is now still alive. He's going to do really well. Don't worry, dude. You don't have to go for those 9-inch charges. You only really have to take your 4-inch charges. You can play way more safely than you would have needed to otherwise because we're winning elsewhere. And the reverse is true as well. It's hey, my shooting phase just collapsed. I didn't kill a single thing on my opponent's side of the board. You need to go find something a little bit more aggressive. You need to try and find a line in order to score more points for our team. And that's a lot of fun. That last part is kind of something that as you get better, as you become a better 40k player and a better teams player in general, you can adjust a little bit more how you're actually playing your own games in order to go for a really big win or maybe a small win, and everything in between. But with all that out of the way, with teams really, really fun, it's really hard to describe. If you've never played teams before, it's kind of hard to describe how different it is and how much more fun it is in a lot of ways. So we're going to go ahead and talk about how teams really functions. So one of the first things that I kind of want to go over before we really get into the meat of how pairings works is the core concept of coming back to that differential scoring. And in teams games, you do not care about what the raw score is. A 50 to 50 win or a 50 to 50 game and a 100 to 100 game are the same. In the same way, a 100 to 80 win and a 50 to 30 win are again the same. You don't care about the raw scores, you only care about the differential. And the thing that you're looking at is how many points did the player who won the game win by? And this one, or in the very common format that we tend to see, it usually goes in increments of 5. So if you win or lose a game by less than 5 points, you're both going to come back with 20, or you're both going to come back with 10. So let me explain that a little bit better. Every game that you play in a team's environment is worth a total of 20 points. And you are trying to like carve up that pie because you want more of that pie for your team and less of it for the other team. So if you win or lose by less than 5 points, you both get half the pie. You both chop those 20 points in half, and you both walk away with 10. But if you win by 6 to 10 points, if you've won by more than 5 points, you get a little bit more of that pie. You walk away with 11, and your opponent only walks away with 9. And it maxes out if you win by more than 50 points. If you get 51 points or more, you're going to walk away with the entire pie, and your opponent is going to walk away hungry. They are going to get absolutely nothing. And so this is kind of what I'm talking about when I was saying that having this differential and playing all 5 turns is really important. Because let's just say you've already lost the game, right? You're in a losing position. We all know you're going to lose. But you don't know if you're going to win, or you don't know if your opponent's going to beat you by about 10 points, or if your opponent's going to beat you by about 20 points. And so you still want to play those last couple of turns, because if your opponent beats you by 12 points, they're going to get 12 points of that pie, and you're still going to walk away with 8. But if you concede in like a singles environment and you give up that 22 points, suddenly your opponent gets more of that pie. They get 14 points and you're only going to walk away with 6. And so you're always fighting for every single one of those points that you can potentially walk away with at the end of the game. You don't want to be the person who gives your opponent these extra 2 points, and that's the difference at the very end between winning and losing. This is the WTC FAQ that they use, and at WTC, if the two teams end between, or so there's 160 points between all 8 games that you play, right? 8 games times 20 points, 160. If both teams end up between 75 and 85 points, it's a draw. Both teams walk away with a tie. But in what you can see, right, if you are the guy who lost by 12 instead of losing by 14, and your opposing team ended up with 84 points, and you get a draw as a team, instead of giving up those 2 extra points in order to give them the round win, that's a really big difference. You're fighting for every single one of those points because it doesn't affect just you. Okay. The next part of this is we're going to talk about pairings a little bit. And in pairings, there are generally 2 ways that it works. There's what you just call like the defender cycle, and there's also the part that's called the scrum. And how many defender cycles and when the scrum is going to depend on how many players are on each team. By far, the most common team sizes are 5-player and 8-player. And we're going to go ahead and talk about how those work. You will also see some events that are 3-player teams or 4-player teams or 6-player teams. I don't think I've ever seen a 2, and I don't think I've ever seen a 7, but in theory, you could do this with any number of players. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what a defender cycle looks like. And in a defender cycle, let's imagine I just randomly generated these teams, so don't worry too much about what the actual matchups and the teams are. But let's assume that both teams have 3 players available to them. Okay. In a defender cycle, you're gonna both put out 1 defender blind. So what I mean by this is, so let's say that we have Knights, Thousand Suns, and Guard as our team, and our opposing team is Sisters, Votan, and Emperor's Children. Don't worry too much about like the actual matchups or the actual like armies here. They're just examples. So we are going to try and figure out what army we want to put out as our defender. And in this example, we'll just go ahead and put Guard. We don't know what our opponent is going to do as their defender. It could be Sisters, they could do Votan, or they could do Emperor's Children. For this example, we're going to just say that they did Emperor's Children. Both teams are going to put out their defender blind. They're not going to know what their opposing defender is. And then we're both going to reveal these at the same time. We put out our Guard, they put out the Emperor's Children. After that, both teams have to put up 2 attackers. And these are players that could potentially play into the opposing defender. So in this example, we only have 2 options. We're going to give them Knights and Thousand Suns, and they only have 2 options. They're going to give us Sisters and Votan. And this is where the game really comes in, because the guard player gets to pick which one of these they want to play against. I'm going to do this at random. Again, don't worry about the example. In this example, we're going to say that the guard player does not want to play up against the sisters, and the Emperor's Children player does not want to play up against the knights. So the guard is going to be playing versus the Votan, and the Emperor's Children is going to be playing up against the Thousand Sons. We put those out onto the pairings board like this, and then the defenders not only get to choose the army that they're playing up against, but they also get to choose the board that they want to play against. So don't worry too much about these board examples, but let's say the guard player wants to play on layout 1, and the Emperor's Children player wants to play on layout 2. Okay? Now, this is a pairing cycle. This is a way that both teams are going to get 2 of their players into pairings. Now, if you're playing a 3-man team, you're done. From this spot, we have the knights, and we have, what was this? The sisters. We've already established 2 of our 3 players on both sides. And then the knights and sisters are the only thing that's left. There will be 1 map left like this. We're done. We've done a defender cycle, and the rejected player ends up over here. Okay, for a 5-man teams, these would go back, and we'll add 2 more players over here. So knights and demons. And we're going to do this exact same thing again. So let's just say it's knights and, oh wow, we both defended knights. Eldar and Drukhari are the options, and then sisters and demons are the options. Knights are going to select the demons. These knights are going to select the Drukhari. Knights versus demons. Knights versus Drukhari. And then these go over here as the rejected. Voila, we pick a couple of maps for these players. We've done 5s. Okay, so the defender cycle is how you get 2 players per team, and then if you're an odd number of players per team, then you end up with this extra guy. Okay, so those are very common in, like I said, 5-mans. You will generally do that twice in most pairing systems. Let's go ahead and talk about the other really interesting part, which is the scrum. And I will organize this real quick. Okay. Organize. Voila, look, they're so pretty. Okay, the other part of pairing, so the other style and the other thing that can happen, usually happens, I'm going to put out a bunch of random stuff like this. Don't worry about the actual armies. So we've already done, this is very common in 8s or 6s or 4s. Generally, it'll happen whenever you have like an even number of players, you will end up having the scrum. Okay, and this is a little bit more involved. So we've already gotten half of the team, or half of each team already set up into their play. And now we have 4 things left, and then automatically look at it and go, well, the way that we can do this in a way that's a little bit more interesting, instead of just doing 2 more defender cycles, or rather, we can't do 2 more defender cycles because we will not have enough attackers for the second half of the defender cycle. So what it ends up happening is you will both pick a defender, and then from there, you will still pick 2 attackers. Again, don't worry about the exact armies that we're picking here. And then this last player, they are not going to get paired up against each other. And this is oftentimes called the Forgotten. I've also heard this called the Champion. These 2 players are just going to play each other on whatever board is left. But here in the scrum, we can determine not only just the 2 pairings, but we can determine 3 pairings from this. So the Death Guard, again, pick Thousand Sons, pick this. So Death Guard will go like this, and then Marines will play up against Knights. But then we have these 2 players over here. And these 2 players are going to end up playing up against each other. They're going to fill this last slot in the refused or the rejected spot. And then we'll go ahead and assign boards to them. Okay, and this scrum is really interesting because there's a lot of different variables that are going on here, right? Does Death Guard, or does the Death Guard have a couple of really good matchups still that they want to play against? Do we want to make sure that Drukhari versus Admech never happens? There are different ways to play around this. In general, in WTC style pairings, which is what most of the world plays, you just end up picking the maps. Every single player in the round is going to be playing the same mission. The only question is what map it's going to be played on. I will take a brief moment here. I'm not going to be going over NTL pairings too aggressively, but the major difference between NTL pairings, which are very common in the central and eastern United States, and I believe also eastern Canada, or like Toronto, like does this a little bit. Um, the attacker, the person who did not choose the map, is also going to choose between a couple of missions that that map is played on. It's a little bit more involved. It's not very common outside of the eastern United States, so we're not necessarily going to be talking about it too much. Okay. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are starting to ask, how do we know what armies we want to put up as defenders, what armies we want them to play up against? And the big thing here that I want to show you guys is something that is called a matrix. And most teams that are serious about doing well at an event are going to be building a matrix for most of the rounds that they play. You can do this before you get to the event, but the other big thing is if you have enough time, let's say you go to lunch and you say, okay, let's see what team we're playing up against. Hey, Johnny, do you want to play up against these armies? Hey, Tim, do you want to play up against these guys? And you can build it like on the fly as you're going. But most teams that are serious are going to be building a matrix of some kind. Now, the big thing here that you're going to be doing is, this is me, and this is the team that I took to Challengers Cup. You're going to be taking a look at every single one of the opposing armies and trying to figure out what your likely score is into them. And so an easy example here is I'm playing guard. I think that most of the time when I play up against Eldaria Warhost, I take a look at the list, I'm probably going to get a small win. But realistically, it's not going to be a very large, and this could very easily be, I could get a 9 or I could get a 13 here, depending how the dice and cards actually go. Up against Thousand Suns Grand Coven, I think I'm a little bit more confident. It can kind of go across for every single one. There are different styles that some people like to use for this. I personally like to use numbers, but some people like to use brackets. Oftentimes you'll see a bunch of different teams will be like, anything, if you think it's going to be a draw, if you think you're going to get anywhere between a 9 and 11 or an 8 and a 12, we're just going to color it yellow. Whatever you find works better for your team is going to be good enough. It's just a tool that's useful for you, so you don't have to spend a whole lot of time thinking elsewhere. But the most important thing when we're looking at these and trying to figure out how we're going to be doing our pairing strategy is we look for armies that we have a bunch of greens or blues or a bunch of oranges or reds. So an easy example here, right, is we take a look at this Death Guard list that we were playing up against, and we thought we were pretty comfortable. Basically, everyone on our team thinks that they're going to have a good matchup into this guy. We have like one example, like our Blood Angels player didn't think it was very good, but almost everyone else is like, yeah, I'm going to get at least a draw. The other version of this is on the far end. We take a look at the Admech Skitarii Hunter cohort, and basically no one on our team wants to play against that. That's a matchup where we're just going to be trying to mitigate. And we are looking for, firstly, what can we draw, right? Let's take a look at, like, Admech, right? We don't want to let Admech play against our Tau. We don't want to let it play up against our Orcs. And if we end up making it play up against Tyranids or Blood Angels, that's about as good as we can get. Whereas on the other hand, we can probably get a pretty big win out of the Death Guard. We can maybe get a decent win out of the World Eaters or the Orcs. Whereas up against Eldar, we're probably just going to be playing for a draw no matter what. And so we're looking for a couple of different ways that we can find, they're often called wedges, where we can like drive a wedge into the way that their pairing strategy works. And so a great example here is up against Thousand Suns. We have 3 players that think that they have a good matchup into Thousand Suns. We're going to do everything, or we might do everything that we can in order to make sure that one of these players ends up playing against their Thousand Suns. We're going to hold these players back and make sure that when the Thousand Suns shows up, we're like, okay, now we're going to make sure that you have to play either Tyranids or World Eaters. And so when you take a look at this, it might not make a ton of sense, but I want to talk about a couple of different roles that will come up when you're taking a look at how all of this works. The one other thing I want to say before I move on to the team roles is this matrix that we built is inaccurate, right? There are things in this matrix that are just wrong. Maybe we have players that have only played against weaker players on that faction. They don't actually have a good idea of how the better players will play it. Maybe they've never played the matchup at all. Maybe this time they're playing up against this army, they've got like a couple of different units. Maybe it's not Canis Rex and a bunch of War Dogs like we're used to playing up against Imperial Knights. Maybe this time instead it's just like 3 Atrapos and Canis Rex, and it just drastically changes how it works. And the thing about this is our matrix is incorrect, but so is our opponents. There's not a single matrix that has ever been made that is 100% entirely correct. It's the best guess that we can always make. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about some team roles and what we generally look at them. I'm going to go back towards the pairings board in order to talk about this. So the first role, and one of the most important things that we can look at, is the scoring defender. And a scoring defender is a player and an army. It's usually an army that cares more about the board that they're playing on than the army that they're playing against. And something that you can think of is, let's imagine this board. This is Games Workshop Layout 5. And let's imagine this is played on Hammer and Anvil, right? Where the deployments are like this and like this, right? There's absolutely nowhere to hide on this board if you were to play it on Hammer and Anvil. And so something like Montclaw Tau or Combined Arms Guard or some versions of AdMech, there's a couple of different like styles where it doesn't matter what they're playing against, it's going to be a good board for our army. A scoring defender cares about the board more than they care about the matchup. Okay? What we generally do with scoring defenders is we want to defend them first. They're the first thing that we oftentimes want to throw down because we have the most control over what board that they can actually play on. The reverse of this isn't quite as true on Games Workshop boards as it is on WTC boards. But if we take a look at Layout 8, this one is relatively closed, and it does mean that a lot of melee armies are going to do better on this board than they would on something else. So something like World Leaders or Orcs are going to have a better time on this board than they would on other boards, and so we can use them as a scoring defender as well. Okay, the next thing that we generally look at is a blunting defender. The first defender is usually a scoring defender, and the second defender is not always, but is oftentimes a blunting defender. A blunting defender is someone who doesn't care what they're playing against. Yeah, put me on any map, whatever. I don't care what army I'm playing up against. I'm going to be playing a close game. And great examples of this are things like Tyranids or Necrons, where they score very steady. Their opponent is going to score very steady, but they have some tools, right? Like Necrons Awakened Dynasty is almost always going to get a win on primary, whereas Tyranids with the Shadow and the Warp, their opponent just is going to be scoring maybe 5 to 10 fewer primary than they had initially expected, and Tyranids are going to be scoring secondaries really well with the Biovore just putting Spore Mines and scoring an extra point on engage on all fronts here, an easy area denial with the Spore Mine over there, things like that. And blunting defenders, they're generally going to be taking matchups, right? Like we were looking at before with the AdMech. No one on our team wanted to play up against AdMech, but the Tyranids player is going to be like, yeah, it's fine. I'll play against AdMech. I don't really care. We're going to get a very stable score no matter what over there. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is attacker pairs and triples. And this is generally the kind of thing where you're trying to get armies that are just trying to beat up on certain things that are very common in the meta. So let's imagine a world where knights are very common all over the place. Or at least they were. At WTC, there was just a bunch of knight players everywhere. And there are a couple of matchups where knights just don't do very well. The most famous one was Eldar. You make them play up against 20 fire dragons, and suddenly you can lose 2, 3, 4 big knights all in the same turn, depending on how the fire dragons firing and fading and just doing a lot of damage actually ends up going. That's a really bad matchup. Another example is Genestealer cults. At the time, Knights just could not chew through the number of bodies that Genestealer cults were putting out on the board. And so this is what we would call an attacker pair. They are trying to beat up on the same army. They're trying to beat up on something that we are expecting to be common at this event. And it's the kind of thing where if you can get a pair, you can oftentimes get an opponent trapped by an attacker pair. But even better is if we can find a third army that attack that same kind of thing, where let's just say, I don't know, Recon Guard was a good example as another thing that Knights just can't beat. They did not have the volume. They were always going to be playing for a loss, but they're trying to make it a small loss. And so if we have 20 Fire Dragons Eldar, Host of Ascension GSC, and Recon Guard, they are all three of them going to get wins into Knights. And so we can use this in order to try and pin certain styles of armies. The big thing about having these attacker pairs and triples is they really, really want to be beating up on certain archetypes. And in exchange, you can generally tell them, hey, Mr. Recon Guard player, I want you to go beat up on Knights and other shooting armies, and in exchange, you will never have to play up against a melee army. And if we do end up having you play up against a melee army, we're sorry. It means that we messed up. Oftentimes things that are like attacker pairs are going to be some kinds of skews, right? You can do, triple Dorn Guard and like triple Atrapos Knights can be an example of an attacker pair where your opponent just has too many big bodies that they can't deal with, and some armies won't be able to deal with that. It can also be an attacker pair that I've used in the past was Bridgehead Guard and Retaliation Cadre Tau. They're both dropping guns, they're both dropping and doing a ton of damage in ways that some opponents, they don't have the tools to screen it out. They don't have the way to hide up against that army. And there are plenty of other examples of this, right? You can also do it with like World Eaters and like Orcs, right? They are both going to be putting on a lot of pressure out on the board. They both have access to fight on death, so a bunch of melee armies going in to try and fight them are just not going to have a good time, because as soon as they jump in, fight on death, suddenly they're losing a lot of models that they might not have been losing in most other melee matchups. And so trying to find these ways to beat up on the same kind of armies will give you a lot of fluidity and give you an opportunity to find more big wins. The last example of an army that isn't always there, but something that you should generally be thinking about what the role for this, or what this player is going to be doing, is I like to call them a champion, but it can also be like the forgotten player. And this is a player who generally brings a really good singles list. And the expectation here for the singles list is, yeah, you're going to have game into everything. You need to be ready to play against any army that anyone is going to be bringing, and that last player is basically playing singles. They don't have a lot of control over this, and so if you have a dedicated player, let's just say you have a really strong player who's just a really, really good at singles, you give them the Forgotten. They're the intended player to just play a game. And if you can have someone who's playing a strong singles list by a strong player, oftentimes you can find some advantages that way. The champion isn't always a player that you're going to be putting on your team intentionally, but you should have an idea relatively early on in every time you're doing pairings. This is the person that I'm expecting to just, they have like one really good matchup, one not so good matchup. They're probably not going to be in a spot where I can get them into the good matchup, and I'm definitely not going to let them get pinched in the one bad matchup. They're just going to go play a game and see how they do. I want to end here a little bit with talking about Guard's place in teams, because Guard is an army that has a lot of different things that it can do. So one of the big things about Guard is because we have so many different data sheets and we have the ability to skew in very different ways, Guard can play almost any role you want it to in a team's environment. If you wanted to play Guard as a scoring defender, what you typically do as a scoring defender is you're going to take a bunch of Dorns and a bunch of Russes, and you're going to put it on, or you're going to try and first defend it, and you put it on the most open board available, and they're just going to go out and shoot people to death. You can also play Guard as a blunting defender. One of the main ways that we oftentimes see Guard plays as a blunting defender is you can play it with like 2 Dorns, a bunch of Bulgrin, and then a bunch of stuff in the midboard. Kazrakan and Chimeras, Katachan, maybe some Engineers. They're all just going to just play in the midboard, and it can play like a decent game into basically everything in the meta. Is it going to blow anything out? There's not going to be that many blowouts, but there's going to be a couple blowouts. But more importantly, it's not going to have a bad matchup in anything, and you can use this as your second defender. It can play on almost any board. It doesn't really care about the matchup all that much. There are also ways to play guard as part of an attack or pair or a triple, and these are generally some of the more obscure styles of guard play, some of the less common. So like Hammer the Emperor guard is generally better as in a part of an attacker pair or triple, where you just if you have like Hammer the Emperor guard and you also have like Bringers of Flame Sisters, it's fast, durable gun that your opponent has to deal with. It's a lot of damage 3. Some armies can't handle that. Another good example is Recon Guard. If you pair this up with something like Admech, Skatari Hunter Cohort, or Gene Stealer like Biosanctic, it's just a lot of bodies that your opponent might not be able to deal with. There might be play for like Siege, but I guess the other big example is like Bridgehead. Bridgehead is really good at hunting things like elves. It's really good at hunting Marines just in general. So if you were to pair it up with like Retaliation Cadre Tau, or maybe there's a world where you play like Hypercrypt Necrons or something, armies that do the same thing, armies that attack the game in the same way, in ways that some opponents are simply not going to be able to handle. Guard can kind of do a little bit of everything. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're building up different lists. A lot of different SKU lists are a lot more viable in teams because they're weird and not everybody is going to be able to deal with them. Triple Monolith and Triple Dorn, right? Can your opponent kill T12 2-up save models? Like, a lot of the times they can't. So just setting all of your team up in order to have these kinds of aggressive tools make a lot of sense. Anyway, we're a little bit more than 30 minutes into this video. I hope this has been useful to talk about teams. I hope my enjoyment of teams has come across pretty well, but the big thing here is, again, just go out. If you've never played teams before, it's a really good time. You're going to have a blast. Try and do it with some of your friends, and if you can do that a couple of times, you're going to learn very quickly what does and doesn't work. If you have more questions, please let me know down in the comments, because there's a lot going on in this environment, and I'll talk to you guys all again soon. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.